Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. Today we're going to go through Privado's privacy engineering platform. Perfect. Welcome everyone. My name is Vaibhav Antil. I'm the CEO and founder of Privado.ai. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss a couple of things. We're going to start with going through the concept of why there is this gap between privacy teams and engineering teams, and why do we see this new role of technical privacy professional or privacy engineering role in companies, and this person who's trying to bridge this gap. We are going to then go into understanding what data mapping for engineering looks like. Why is it so challenging? What are the key pain points, pitfalls that as a company, if you have engineers, you face, and how can Privado solve it? We will then show you a quick demo of how data mapping happens in Privado, and then move into the second part of the presentation, which is privacy by design and enabling developers. So we will go and kind of understand how you can go from a more design or review plan in your privacy by design to more of a programmatic strategy using code scans. And then we will give you a quick, nice demo of how it all comes together. So yeah, with that context, let me start. Cool. So if you look at a technology company, right, we have a lot of engineers and there is a central privacy team, but on the product or the engineering side, there are decentralized teams, right? These are small teams who are responsible for innovation, moving things fast, and shipping products fast so the customers get features fast. Your end customers' requirements are taken care of faster, and your revenue increases, right? And a consequence of that is the way engineering is set up today and the way privacy has to do things. There are some big challenges. The first one is data processing. It's distributed, right? It's distributed across multiple teams. Each team has its own data collection, data sharing, data storage. It's distributed across multiple applications that your team are building. It's distributed across multiple services, APIs, data pipelines, right? And when, as a privacy office, you're going from a central view and saying, I want one central map of or some one central data map, you have to literally speak to hundreds or thousands of engineers and product managers to build this initial visibility. And even if you get that initial visibility, the biggest challenge is this is not a static data map that your engineers have built. Essentially, they're releasing new software changes, product changes almost every other week or every week or sometimes every day. And which means your initial understanding, your initial data map, your initial ROBA reports are all out of date. They're all stale. They're not in sync with what your product is, right? Which means as a company, if you want to implement privacy by design or you want to have privacy evidence, if you're a B2B company, or ROPA documentation, whatever you did manually goes out of date every other week. And finally, the biggest friction I see or the biggest problem I see is kind of the speed mismatch. So from a privacy office perspective, you want governance. You want to make sure the promises you have made to your end customers as part of, let's say, a data protection agreement, a list of your sub-processor. Or if you're a B2C company, you might have a privacy policy on do not sell or share data, or a GDPR privacy policy. So as central privacy office, you have a certain commitments that you have to make as a company that you've already made as part of privacy policy or DPAs. But then when it comes to the code, what engineers are writing, there is a big disconnect between the two. There's a disconnect because there is no shared standard or vocabulary. So what you've promised is not going to the end engineer who's building the product. There is a speed mismatch, as we talked about. You are doing annual refresh of your data maps, which builds your privacy policy, but the engineers are making code changes every day. And finally, right now, there is no way for you to enforce this, right? So you cannot enforce that, hey, we have promised that we will never share our sensitive data with any third party, but that could very well be happening because of a new code change, right? So these three things combined, your data being distributed, not just from a technology perspective, but from a team structure perspective, it being changing every week, and this lack of governance leads to a couple of problems. One of the most common ones, which is kind of in the news I've seen, is these inaccurate policies, right? Again, if you go back and see, the central challenges for a tech first company is, your data is distributed, it's always changing, and you don't have any governance, which means as a central privacy team, you have some options to make, right? If you are writing a privacy policy, you can write something which is very granular. or you can, and I've seen that happening, or you can, in which you can make a privacy first claim and for to attracting customers saying, we will never share health data with any third party. And we have seen some fines because of such policies, which was granular but not enforceable. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum is you can write a very catch-all policy, right? It's like, hey, we're going to use customer data for machine learning. We've seen that as a challenge as well because your customers push back. Um, the problem is, in an ideal world, you want to write a granular policy, but the thing that you miss is visibility and collaboration with the engineering team, which means if you write a granular policy with lack of visibility, you end up getting fined by FTC or the regulator. Because you don't have visibility, you might go and write a catch-all policy, in which case your customers might push back, right? And then, so ultimately where you want to be is in the Nirvana square, where you have granular policy because you have good visibility, you have good collaboration, right? And how we see companies do this is basically, again, from a risk and speed perspective. I've seen like as companies kind of start to get more fine and they have more scrutiny, what they do is if you look at this graph where you can either have high speed, but then high risk because you are not reviewing everything, or low risk, low speed because you are reviewing everything. So I would say companies fall somewhere in this spectrum, in between this spectrum, right? And as your fines are increasing, you might move towards reviewing everything. Or if your company is in the growth mode, you might not be able to review because your privacy teams are small. Wherever you fall in this graph, in today's presentation, I want to come to you and say, hey, review whatever you want to do, but if you employ a strategy like a privacy code scanner, it would essentially decrease the risk at whatever speed you are, right? So if you were reviewing 100 changes a month, and wherever that falls in the graph, with privacy code scanning, it will reduce the risk because it will automatically check for 100 more things, right? So that's kind of what we're going to discuss is, we know there is a gap because of which you have policies or external commitments you're not sure of, again, which leads to this problem of, from a risk speed perspective, how do you make that choice? And there's always some friction here. Um, Awesome. And then if you look at kind of the tools that exist today in the marketplace, right, on or how privacy teams are trying to solve this problem. So if you look at the data lifecycle of how data comes into your company and where it goes, ultimately most of the modern scanning automated tools, which are data discovery tools, lie on the extreme right. They will go in and scan your databases and data lakes and tell you, hey, here is where your data lies, which is good if you want to just protect your data from a security perspective. But privacy is not just about securing data, right? You need the context of data. Where was this data collected? What was the purpose of data collection? How is it being used? Where is it being shared? Uh, a common FTC fine was phone number was supposed to be collected for MFA, but there was a data flow to an advertising third party or was used in an advertising service, right? So privacy is more than finding data at rest. It's also finding how that data get used. And what we found, or in our approach, which we'll show you today, is all of this logic of data collection, data sharing, data storage, data transformation, data processing actually lies in the code. And from a footprint perspective, the data size of the data is actually smallest in the code, and it grows exponentially towards the end, which is where currently you might be scanning to figure out where your data is. Another analogy is you can be in a place where it kind of feels like what you're trying to do is you are at a beach and you're trying to wipe away, or you're trying to like clean the beach from water, right? Because water is constantly coming in, data is constantly coming in, and rather than fixing things at the source, which is at the code, you're only focusing on, data at rest, right? So we're going to talk about this as well. So shifting gears and taking one specific example of when we are looking at data mapping and specifically data mapping for engineering, what are the key challenges that you might be facing and how Privado solves that? So the first one we see is it's super manual and time consuming, right? And there is a process problem and a technology problem again for this. The process problem is you have thousands of engineers who are building products, services on behalf of you, and which means you have to talk to these thousands of engineers, right, to build your data map. The second problem is the way you do data mapping today is you go to an engineer or an engineering lead or product manager and you say, hey, let's define this thing called processing activity. And then from there, let's do the data mapping. The problem is this ad hoc processing activity definition does not scale. You cannot interview hundreds of engineers to build this. Second, it's very detached from how engineers are writing code. They write code and maintain code as part of applications or services, not in terms of a business process. So you should be aligned on that. So that's the big challenge. The first challenge is you end up spending a lot of time to get the initial data map. And when you do that, because of this ad hoc nature and you're relying on human input, first of all, the biggest thing I've seen is the reason it's inaccurate and incomplete is when you ask a developer what personal data you process, they might be thinking, oh, the privacy team is asking me about PII, which is, oh, I don't process any personal data. I only have email address, right? So because there's this lack of shared vocabulary between privacy and engineering teams, you get inaccurate. There's also a problem because not one engineer has built a product. It might have been built over the years. It might be a new product. Multiple teams might be involved. And you're trying to ask too many questions, right? You're only asking questions. You're not giving value, which means you only get some results back. So that's the second big problem I've seen. So it's manual. What you get is inaccurate. And finally, let's say you put in a lot of money behind the data mapping project, 6 months, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. The end result is a static, out of date data map because the product would have changed by then. There would be a weekly product release. It's not integrated in the development workflow. So you will never get notified that you have a new subprocessor. And at the end of the day, you will again fail an audit. And then at the end of the audit, you will say, we're going to go and refresh our data maps annually, right? Now, that's the central problem is the data maps are changing daily and weekly, and you are refreshing them annually. So this is kind of the problem we've seen in technology first companies or companies with engineers, specifically when you're trying to do data mapping for engineering. I see there are comments, but no questions so far. Awesome. So this is how kind of Privado solves this problem. So essentially, Privado integrates with your source code management systems and build this dynamic data maps in 5 minutes. Literally, our point of integration and the full time to go live and start the scan and give you the results in 5 minutes. What we do is, again, if you go back to the diagram on the data lifecycle, what we're doing is we are scanning the code of any product, any application, be it a mobile app, be it a backend system, be it a data analytics system that your engineers, your developers have built. We run a scan on that and give you a couple of outputs. One is we discover and classify data. What data is being collected? Where is it being shared? Where is it being stored? What processing is happening and how it changes over time. And once we have this global view of data and data flows and data maps, then we can also add governance. We can ensure if a new third party gets added, you are notified, the DPA sign, and all of those things can be taken care of. Net, because of our tight integration with development workflows, you get this automated data mapping really, really quickly. And this is kind of another view of how different the data mapping for engineering kind of works. Once we run a scan, again, we are not limited in terms of connectors or integrations. We don't have to integrate with each third party separately. We have one single point of integration, after which we're able to give you a data visibility across all the products your engineers have built in terms of what is the data you're collecting, where is the data going, which third party, which database, which internal service, how is that changing over time? Is that being sent to logs where it can be breached? All of that information across your entire engineering department, we are able to generate this within minutes, right? Another big problem that we see is typically when you look at data discovery, you have some connectors, like maybe 20 connectors, 30 connectors that you can scan for. And the problem is, if you look at the top 20 SDKs for mobile apps, the coverage for the data discovery tool does not exist there, right? Because the data is very dynamic, it goes through the code, and that's why you don't have the data flow visibility there. Awesome. So next, what we'll do is we'll kind of move to our demo. And but kind of before we do that, essentially, this is what Privado enables you is once you integrate with us, instead of having manual data maps, you go to more automated data maps, which are on demand, one-click integration, no manual questions ever asked, no engineering efforts. You get a complete source of truth from the code. So the way engineers are writing code, you get a data map from that. You also change your strategy. So instead of asking questions about, hey, what do you do with data? You're actually going to an engineer saying, here is what you're doing with data. We already know that. And just tell us the purpose of it. So when you show and then you ask them to either fix or tell you, then you get a lot more buy-in, a lot more information. And finally, the most important thing is from a time-saving perspective, the initial data maps are fast, it's automated, you don't have to spend time, but there is no effort needed in terms of making sure those are updated. Whenever there is a code change which happens, the data maps automatically update. They're always dynamic, they're evergreen, which means you don't have to do annual refresh, you never fail your audit, you don't have to go back to management to ask for budget for an every year annual data map exercise. Moving on. So I see there is a question from Prasanna on how many organizations would allow us to integrate this solution with their source code. So yeah, in our experience, this is actually a pretty low touch integration in terms of, if you look at from a privacy perspective, you're not actually scanning real data. So the risk from a privacy perspective is way less. You're not scanning your customer, your end user data. And from a operationalizing perspective, right now in your company, wherever you are, there are at least 4 or 5 code scanners running for different things. So someone is running a code scanning for security, someone is running for code quality, someone is running to detect secrets, someone is detecting to find open source libraries which have license compliance issues, right? So at this moment in your company, whenever a code change happens, 4 or 5 scans run for different things, but not for privacy. What Privado is doing is utilizing the same workflow, but adding a privacy check there. So in our experience, most of the companies are familiar with it. They're very open to scan their code. The deployment could be different. They might want a SaaS deployment. They might want an on-prem deployment, depending on how other scans are running. But scanning their code is a very, very established process in companies. We have never seen pushback on code scan from a company. They're already doing it, very familiar. They really like it as well. Moving on. Awesome. So what I'm going to do now is I've already connected some code repositories that I've scanned. Again, reaching this place was probably like 4 or 5 minutes. I'm going to show you what all we discovered. And we're going to take a couple of examples to see what this data map look like for a company like you, and then how you can utilize the same, right? So as of now, we can see there are 15 code repositories where we discovered personal data. Overall, 38 data elements were discovered. 7 of them were sensitive. We have 80 third-party integrations inside the code that we have discovered. And then what we can do is we can start from a global view of data inventory, saying, let's first look at what all we have as a company. What are our top data categories? So for example, personal identification, account data, what are our top data elements, social media contacts. This is the most shared data element in the company. Email address is the second most shared data element, so on and so forth. And then also get an answer on, okay, the 80 third parties or where are they kind of located? What's their hosting location? What are your top third parties and what are the most recently added third parties? So this data inventory section is kind of giving you like a company-wide overview of what data you have and what third parties you have, what databases you have, what APIs you have, right? But you can then go in and start to get more information, right? So for example, this view is giving you a list of all the data elements that Privado has discovered across the account. And then you can pick any one of them and say, I want to figure out what's happening with the email address because you might be getting a DSAR request or for some other use case. And then you can first of all, very easily see the list of all third parties where data is being shared with. And when you click here, you also see a global data flow diagram of email address going to all these third parties, these databases, these log leakages, all of this is automatic, right? So what you have kind of done is so far, privacy teams have asked 0 questions. The only thing they've done is done one integration, the scans have run, and you've gotten this very nice view of all the data elements which exist in the across all the products. And then you can also configure saying, okay, show me all the high sensitive data element, right? So for example, there is illness or medical condition, which is GDPR sensitive. There's social security number, there's precise location, medical certificates. And you can see the data flow for illness or medical condition. It's going to Google Firebase, Google AdMob, OpenAI, Facebook, right? All of this is powered by our code scan. The same information is available for third parties as well, where you might be wondering about, let's say you have a generative AI use case and your company is actively integrating Gen AI tools like OpenAI. Privado actually discovers them in the code. So not only that, it tells you what data is going there, because right now there's no way to get this information where OpenAI scanner does not exist. So it tells you that OpenAI is getting these data elements from the code, and then you can double down and say which product is sharing this, and then there is a specific application which is named email vector DB, which is sharing this. So you have a full lineage of what data is shared with a specific third party from which specific repository. Moving on, we will, the same information again is available for databases, APIs, all of that. But what we're going to focus now is we're going to take one or two examples of a backend system and a front-end system to show you the core discovery and how Privado discovers these data elements, right? So let's take this example of something called a Privado accounts API. So first of all, we were able to discover, as you can see, here is a nice data flow diagram for this specific application or backend service, wherein it's connected to a database called user accounts. There are some collection points, and there are some third parties which are integrated on inside this service, right? And then there are more information which are mentioned here, like the name of the application, who owns the repository. This is also automated, and some more information, right? As we go down, another interesting thing you will see in Privado is not only we scan the code to tell you the data, but we also extract legal processing activities. So for example, if a person who's from the privacy team looks at this and if they're not able to understand what Privado accounts API is, you can read the list of processing activities and you get the same information. So for example, there are two processing activities here: user profile retrieval, and the second one is user account management. And if you read the description, it basically explains that this repository is doing sign up, authentication, and getting the details of a profile of a user. So you can display it back on your mobile app or website, right? So this is all automatic, powered by our code scan. And next, we would jump into the core discovery, which is this data element discovery. Let's start from there. So for example, here we can see there are about 8 data elements that Privado discovered: account name, phone number, email address, so on and so forth. All of them have a category. You can attach tags to them, you can change the sensitivity, but what you're seeing here is a nice description of email address: where is it being shared, where is it being stored, are there any collection points, are there any log leakages? And when you look at this information, you get a nice data flow diagram of where is it coming from and where all is it going, right? So the points of entry, which is slash, in this case is slash authenticate slash sign up because it's a backend service, and where is it being shared? So we know email address in this specific product is going to SendGrid and Slack, and it's being stored at user accounts database, and it's being read from that as well. I know there is a question. If there are any questions, feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A section. I'll pick them up for sure. Now, once you have this information, the biggest problem I've seen is once you build the initial data flow diagram, when you're going to engineers, how do you prove that you know this information, that email address is going to SendGrid or Slack is correct? So Privado also gives you a very code level visibility. So if you go to the code analysis tab, again, what we're trying to do is bridge this privacy engineering gap and be that connective tissue. When you as a privacy team look at it, you want to figure out where email address is going. But when you want to, for example, say to an engineer, please stop sending email to Slack, you can come here and see the flow. You can come here and see, here is how email address in my code goes from this file to ultimately Slack here, right? So there is a line by line example of how email gets transformed and ultimately becomes message, which goes into Slack, right? So we have a line by line example of a data flow. This is very easy when you're talking to an engineer, when you're sending this issue to Jira, they can look at this example and basically come to the point where there is a privacy issue, fix it, and all of this back and forth between privacy and engineering teams is solved. So they look at code, whereas you look at these nice data flow diagrams. And you can see the same is true for all other, like first name has a different data flow diagram. You can also look at the same from a perspective of third party. So you can look at like SendGrid and say, okay, build me a data flow diagram for SendGrid, and it will do the same. Right. So now, so far, what we did was we looked at one example of, this is basically a microservice or a backend service that someone has built for sign up. And this is one example for that. Before I go any further, I can see there are some Q&A. And so I'm going to answer those as well. So there was a question around static analysis. Uh, that's a great question, Justin. So yeah, so the interesting piece about Privado and our technology is we essentially build like a graph of your code, wherein for us it does not matter. So for example, if I go back to the email address example, and just give me a second, let me dismiss it and show you the flow. It's really like for example, the Slack example. If you look at the endpoint here, the actual data which is going is something called message, right? So we are not tagging this as saying that, hey, from message, we are not inferring that email is going there. We have a full transformation of variables inside the code, that there was something called email, which was part of, sorry if that, let me reshare. So we know basically that there was something called email, which was part of sign up. And then the sign up got transformed, became message here. And then that message went to Slack, right? From a technology perspective, we tag variables and classes inside the code as personal data. For that, we have pattern matching, machine learning models, and then we have exit points from the code and entry points. So entry points are collection, exit points are API call, SDKs, databases, read write function, messaging queues. Anything from where data can go out is tagged in Privado as a sink. And then we have these sources, which are variables or classes, and the data flow goes across the file to build this nice data flow diagram for you. Moving on, again, as I said, this was one example of a service where we showed you both the discovery and how the flows work. I'm going to show you the same thing, but for a front-end app, right? In this case, it's going to be, here is like a website, so it's not a backend system where we ran the scan. And I'm going to show you how this differs, right? So for example, in this case, there is this thing called social security number. And in this case, if you look at the collection points are actually user form. And so when we started scanning the code of a website, which is different from a backend system, you start to see forms, right? So, and again, when you see it here, you will see the thing which was tagged is basically a form which has a SSN tagged, and that's why social security number was tagged, right? So again, for us, the technology doesn't matter. We will scan your user-facing products, so mobile app, websites, backend system, data analytics system, data science system, all of them to build this data flow diagrams. Um, so that was the second part, right? And again, inventory wise, you get a list of inventory of what all is integrated inside the code. Now, once you have this information, there are a couple of things you want to do. One of the main GDPR use case you do want to do is basically run a ROPA assessment. So I'm going to kind of show you that use case as well. So I'm going to take now a different repository where we have run the scan and we have everything. And I'm going to send an assessment to a developer, which is going to be me, and show you how it works. So now remember, the current way to do a ROPA assessment inside the company is you circulate an Excel sheet and people fill this information. With Privado, the main difference is you first do it on a product or an application that the engineer has built. So they have the context, they know what they're answering. Second, it's pre-filled. So the description is generated from the code. We also read other systems to pre-fill things like product line, team ownership. And then the most critical thing we've seen that developers miss or privacy teams get wrong information on is data. Here, the biggest advantage is not only we discover data, when the engineer looks at it, they can look at the exact line of code and say, okay, this is what Privado marked it as order ID, and give feedback if it was right, mark it confirmed. If it was wrong, mark it false positive. And based on that, these information will either stay in your ROPA report or go away from your ROPA report. This thing actually simplifies the entire ROPA creation process. It removes all the conversations that were supposed to happen. It removes all the language translation, lack of missing vocabulary, because when the engineer gets the assessment, they get exact line of code and they can either mark it confirm or false positive. And again, the ROPA process is super optimized for engineers. All the descriptions are engineer friendly. The workflow is developer friendly. Most of the questions are automated, like we extract the individual category, the source of data, the data inventory, the location of data, and then the pretty much the only thing that they're answering for is things like what's the purpose. So I'm going to add some of the information, like some of the security measures, and details about the retention schedule, right? So let's say I'm going to add this as 7 years. And once this is done, pretty much you have like a filled ROPA report. You can submit, the engineer submits it. You also have approval workflow in case you're interested. But if I go back, what you'll see is pretty much the ROPA report is generated from the code. And now if the code changes ever, this ROPA report will automatically get updated. So again, tagging purposes kind of becomes like a one-time exercise, right? Uh, so yeah, this was kind of the part one of the demo, wherein what Privado was able to do was go in, run a scan, build your data inventory, right? So tell you list of all data elements, all third parties, all databases. Not only that, if you were worried about some specific data element, like for example, illness or medical condition, it gives you a list of applications inside your company which processes those, and then the corresponding data flow. The same is true for third parties, databases, all of that. And then on a specific product or a repository, we were able to get the scan, send an assessment, generate our ROPA, which will be dynamic, evergreen, and automatic, right? All of this is powered by our code scan, which is super automated. Basically, integration is 5 to 10 minutes, and you get an advantage where you can go in and start to get all the information. I'm going to take a minute and answering the question. So yeah, I think I did answer the static analysis question. If there's any follow-up question, feel free to answer that as well. Ask that in the chat as well. I see. How do you, Prasanna has a question, how do you scan the codes when the organization have multiple segment? So the good part about Prasanna is, again, we're not doing something fresh. Companies maintain their code in central source code management tools like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, Azure, wherever they are maintaining. It is generally maintained in one place. It is version controlled, which is the next segment I'm going to talk, because from a privacy by design perspective, code changes are controlled, and that's where we want to put a privacy check as well. How to display the data flow for data password? Yes, so Stephen, to answer your question, for us, SQS, Kafka, they are, I don't think I have it on this specific demo instance, but we do detect producer and consumer. You're absolutely right. And we show that as data going in and out as well from a specific repository. So that is discovered as well. And APIs as well. So API actually, maybe I can show as an example. Maybe let me just see Raccoon, because this is a good example. Again, this is an open source repository. This is not our data. Let me close these tabs. And if you look at, for example, social security number, and if you look at the code here, you will see this this SSN is going to this place, which is in Surely. And here, the way we are able to determine that this is in Surely is because this is where this API call essentially was interpreted by Privado. Another example of that could be here, where you can see there is an endpoint. Let me see if I can see the URL as well in this specific call somewhere. But if you can see here, essentially, this is an API endpoint where the call was being made. And what we do essentially to figure this out was the URL which was going in here, we were able to match it to saying, okay, this is a specific, this endpoint is basically headwigit.com, and then there was a flow from social security number till this point. So yeah, we are able to detect API calls, SDK calls, database read and write functions, Kafka queues, anything, any place from where data can come into your systems and go out, Privado is able to detect. Great. So I'm going to go back to the second half of the presentation, which is around privacy by design, and then show you some of those use cases as well. Great. So let's start from a very basic use case on, privacy by design, right? So essentially, what companies are trying to do is make sure the new software changes, big products which are being launched, have privacy built in from the get-go, right? And a typical way to do it is doing privacy impact assessment at the design stage. And as we looked at the start of the presentation, how technology teams work is innovation is decentralized. These changes are sometimes small enough for them to not come to the privacy teams. The number are a lot, which means you cannot only rely on assessment, and they kind of fall through the funnel, so they don't really reach you. So what Privado kind of enables you to do is moving from just assessment-based approach to a more programmatic approach, wherein we are doing continuous privacy monitoring. Essentially, any code change that happens, we check against your commitments to the user. It could be a data protection agreement that you have signed. It could be a privacy policy. It could be your internal policies. It could as well be your PIA that you have done at the design stage. We also help you protect data. So any accidental leak of data, accidental logging of data, all of that is prevented by Privado. And then it basically makes sure, again, from a privacy by design perspective, your data flow diagrams are up to date. So whatever you are reviewing is actually accurate. It's not inaccurate. And the assessment is powered by something which is live, something which is true. Moving on again, from a software development lifecycle perspective, if you look at the different stages, you have the requirement stage and the design stage where architecture is being decided. That's where you're typically doing a privacy impact assessment or a privacy engineering assessment or a technical privacy review. Privado has a hook there. The second is generally development and testing. That's where you are trying to get the initial data maps, doing ROPAs, finding any privacy issues. And once you deploy it, you want to make sure whatever was done before this. So if you did a privacy impact assessment and an engineer told you that, or the product manager told you that they're never going to process personal data in this new feature, Privado ensures at the deployment stage that is true. And if it's not true, then it stops the change. It helps you, re-review the privacy impact assessment. And then, make sure whatever you're releasing, the documentation is up to date. It follows your policy. There are no privacy risks, right? Again, going back, you can move to a place where you have less privacy assessments and less risk because there is something which is lightweight, consistent, automated in your software development lifecycle, continuously checking. Another thing that a privacy code scanner or a platform like Privado enables you to do is engineering enablement, right? So if you look at the current way privacy is done at companies, or privacy by design is done at companies, is the main focus point is to do either look at things at the design stage and look at each product requirement document or do a full-on assessment to find privacy risks, document them, and then give engineers, sometimes you give a control to them. Sometimes it's just you're mapping risk and saying, okay, is this allowed or not? Can I sign off on this or not, right? That's typically the process. But if you look at from an engineer's perspective, they want to make sure they can launch products live without any risk, right? They want to respect customer data as well. So a different approach to that Privado enables you to do is you can continue to do your regular privacy review process, wherein let's assume a Jira ticket gets created, which starts a threshold assessment, and based on that, you do a PI or whatever, right? But parallelly, there is a Privado process running. Wherever a code change happens, Privado runs a privacy code scan, which is you can see PR raised to dev. This is the blue section. And then we basically calculate drift. We calculate drift in terms of what has changed because of this code change. Are you collecting more data? Are you sharing more data? Are you logging data? Is there a new data flow? Are you going to drop more cookies? Whatever changes because of that code change, if there is a change, then we give the engineer guidance. And there are 2-3 things which can happen. Imagine there is a small change which happens, right? Let's say if someone drops a cookie, you don't want to do an assessment. You just want the engineer to onboard that cookie to your CMP. If someone adds a new third party, you want them to make sure the DPA is signed, right? Whereas, let's say if the change is big, massive, right? You start to collect biometric data, right? In that case, there is a requirement maybe from the law that you want to do a PI or a DPI, or sometimes there could be no change. There's just a button color change and no privacy impact exists, right? So based on that, what Privado is enabling, if you focus on the drift function, drift decision point, is if there is no change, the PIA remains closed. You have less PIs. If there is a minor change, instead of doing a privacy review, you give the engineer guidance directly. If there is a major change, then you open up the PI which was done, or you open a fresh PI with pre-filled information. So again, you're still saving some time in the existing privacy impact assessment or privacy review. How this could look like for an engineer is slightly different. So here are some basic policies that you can configure in Privado. They come out of the box. Is let's say if an engineer adds a new cookie, to your website, and this is not a third-party cookie, so you don't know which engineer added this. Sorry, you don't know which engineer added this new cookie, and that's a big struggle, right? You have to figure out who added, so you can go to them and make sure they're adding consent for that. marketing cookies or advertising cookies are still straightforward. You can go to someone in marketing, who handles this and get the answer. So in this case, let's say if someone adds a new cookie, the engineer gets the privacy guidance or privacy engineering guidance saying, hey, you have to make sure max expiry is less than a year or up to a year, and you have to onboard it to our CMP. Here is the link to that CMP, and here is how you do it. Another example could be someone adds a new data table. If that happens, you want to make sure it's onboarded to your DSAR service, deletion service. There is a retention defined. If there is user inactivity, that leads to deletion. So this is kind of your operation work. But as your things are changing, you want to pass this guidance to the engineer and not detect them in production. Because if you detect them in production, then there is a new cycle. You have to reprioritize them. A new sprint has to start, and that wastes both privacy teams' time and engineers' time, and that leads to increased privacy debt as well. Similarly, if there's a new user form, a date of birth, you can give them a guidance on using age or year of birth. There's location, you can ask them to use course location. If there's new third party, you can make sure there's a DPA sign, or you can decide to do a full-on privacy impact assessment as well. So the guidance is flexible, but the main insight that we see is you go from a place where you're always asking questions to giving guidance to engineers as part of their development lifecycle in a very lightweight way. So they don't have to give you a ton of information, something which is consistent, which means every time they make a change, they get a guidance and it's automated. So someone is taking care of privacy when you're not around. Perfect. And moving on to the demonstration part of this, let me see before I go there if there are any questions. I'll be happy to answer those as well. So yeah, feel free to drop in any questions that you might have, and I will go into and explain how the privacy by design concept works. So now, since we look at how you can move to the code to kind of get the same privacy risk or privacy issues, here's how Privado enables you to do. So in the first part, we saw there is a lot of data inventory and data maps and data flows you get. But let's say as a central office, you want to focus on certain issues. You can go in and configure certain policies in Privado. For example, you can go in and say, we want to make sure, let's say from an FTC perspective, that personal data is never shared with advertising third parties. And this could be one of your policies. And Privado is going to enforce this. Or you can say financial data should never be shared with third party. That could be your policy. Or you can say, we want to make sure sensitive data are never logged because sensitive logs more people have access to, right? So these are policies that you come out of the box in Privado, or you can configure a setup. The interesting thing is once these policies are enabled, it first will help you to find issues live in your product, right? Which means you can go in today, use Privado, run a scan, get the data map, and get a list of issues saying, okay, show me all the issues which exist in my product, right? And for example, then you can say, okay, I want to go it by policy and say, tell me my do not sell or share policies, that I created for FTC. And it's going to give you a list. So it's going to say, for example, in this case, you have kind of password being shared with Google AdMob, right? This is one example. Or you can kind of start looking at more example, right? So this is another example where you have health data being shared with advertising third parties, right? So this is one example wherein you have actual line of code responsible for leaking health data to advertising third parties. And this can be sent to Jira as is, so the engineer can fix it. So you go from a place where you get the data map, you find issues in the code which exist live in your product, which can be fixed immediately. So that's one part of the privacy by design story, right? Another, I'm going to give a couple more examples, right? For example, we wrote saying social security number should never be logged. Here is an example where social security number was being logged, and someone asked, how do you figure out if body has social security number? This is a good example of that. If I go in and actually look at it, it has a full flow. It starts as SSN and gets logged here. Now, the problem is this is being logged in console, which means malwares can actually access these SSN. And this is a big vulnerability that has been exploited as well in the past. So this is a big privacy risk which exists that you were able to find from Privado, send to the engineer and fix it as well. So again, it's going to help you find privacy issues and gaps in your product without sending any questionnaire to anyone, but rather giving engineers fixes. So you go from a place where you're always asking questions to a place where you're showing them and getting things fixed. So that was the first part. What I'm going to show you is another privacy by design policy, which is new inventory. So new inventory is nothing. It's a very simple policy I configured for the demo, is wherein anytime if a new data, a new third party gets triggered, Privado is going to create an issue for that. So I'm going to take two examples. I'm going to go ahead and try it out live and hope that Murphy's law is on my side, and kind of show you how this entire thing works, right? Um, Great. So let me take a first example of this specific service, and let's start with Google Tag Manager. Let me see where it is added and kind of start replicating what an engineer typically does, right? Awesome. So let's see. Yeah. So yeah, what I'm going to do here is act like an engineer who wants to add a new third party. In this case, going to be TikTok. So let me find the code there that I had commented. So yeah, this is basically a TikTok pixel that as an engineer, because it's a requirement that came from marketing that I wanted to add, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. But before I do that, let me see if this has PR integration enabled where it is. So I'm going to do that and act like an engineer who's regularly doing things. This is fully version controlled. So a pull request gets opened. I'm going to do that and create it and show you the full development workflow, right? So all of this that you're seeing is happening in the developers tool where they are regularly coding and introducing some privacy risk. In this case, what they're trying to do is they're trying to add a new third party. So this is one example wherein what's happening is the moment this happened, you can see there is a Privado scan running. We're going to see this result in a minute. As this is happening, let me do this for another example. Let's start from here. And yes, so I'm going to do this for data elements as well. So this is a different product altogether, in which case what I'm going to do is enable adding two new data elements, which are device ID and advertising ID. So again, nothing too crazy. All I'm doing is act like an engineer who's A was adding new third party or B was adding new data element. And I'm going to show you how it all comes together. So again, this is super normal for your engineers if you have not seen this. They typically create this pull request where new code changes are pushed, and the moment it happens, Privado is running a scan. Let's see the other one. The scan is still running. As it's running, what I'm going to demonstrate is we're going to create issues both here on GitHub and also back in the product. While the scans are running, if there are any questions, feel free to ask these questions in the Q&A section as well, or in the chat. Works too. Great. So we have the first check run. So as you can see, what has happened if you are a developer who made a change to add TikTok to your product, which I did as an engineer, Privado actually stopped that and said, hey, you have a new privacy issue as part of your product. And this is something that we do not allow, or whatever you want to do, it's all there, right? So you are able to actually give guidance to the engineer where they work, not in some other tool, right? So this was one example. The same thing you can see here. In this case, Privado said, hey, you are adding two new data elements, device identifier and advertising identifier. They can go check the result, see where Privado marked this specific data. They can look at the file name, and then it will be all annotated, right? So from an engineer's perspective, they see everything on why we have done it. But from a privacy perspective, from a privacy by design perspective, you have a way to go into an engineer's workflow and give them a guidance saying, you're adding these two new data elements, or you're adding this new third party. We want you to fix this. We want you to give us some more context. We don't want you to do that, so on and so forth. So you can imagine all the use cases. It's anything is possible, but the main interesting thing that you get with the code scan is you get the ability to not only do the initial data mapping, but also become part of your developer's workflow. So whenever they're making changes, you are giving them guidance automatically. It's in a lightweight way, it's consistent, it's automated, it always runs for you. So that was the second part of the webinar, and open to, I know we have only 9 minutes left, so open to Q&A, and happy to take any answers or questions as well. Let's give the questions a couple more minutes. I see there are some getting answered. I know Sifas had a question. Is there a trial? Yes, there is. If you are interested, you can drop on our website. There is a schedule a demo button, and then our team would reach out for you to try it. Our core product is like the scanner is also open source in case there are any engineers on the call who want to try it out. You can do that. That's also listed on our website. Let's see. Great. So we'll wait another minute for if there are any more questions, else we will save everyone some time. Um, do you have this demo in your website? Unfortunately, no, Prasanna, but you will get the recording as well of this, so you can see that. There's another question, which is, do you have any open technical training on the tool? Yes, we do have. We have full documentation attached to the tool I mean, all our documentation is open that you can utilize. Got it. I see one more question from the community, which is how Privado helps with generative AI LLMs. Um, yeah, so great question. Essentially, yeah, again, I can go back to the product and give you like let me reshare actually. I don't know if I was able to share the right Google Chrome. Okay. Um, so if you look at how these Gen AI tools are being integrated, most of the, at least B2B companies and even now B2C companies have started to integrate third-party LLMs or open source LLMs in their code. Again, with Privado, if you go back, as I showed, you can actually see there is a third party called OpenAI, which Privado discovered, which is the most popular LLM tool in the market. And this was integrated into two products, Health AI Bot and Email Vector DB. Not only that, it was via an SDK. We have discovered in our own customers API calls to OpenAI, and then what data actually is flowing there. So the interesting piece is a lot of these generative AI tools are deeply being integrated into your products and applications. And Privado will give you both the visibility and the control on what data actually goes into these Gen AI tools. The same is true, by the way, for databases. So like, for example, if there is any open, like if there's any uh, generative AI or vector databases is what they call that we discover. I think this is another example. I think you should be able to see that. So for example, in this case, there is vector DB called VV8, which Privado discovered as well. So yeah, from a Gen AI perspective, we are able to discover both open source use and third-party LLM use inside your applications. How much of a customization required for this? So whatever you saw was out of the box. We did not do any changes. In this demo, everything runs on their own. And however, there is a possibility on you can still customize it. You can add more rules. All of that is possible. There was some question around international data transfer. Can you send me? Yeah, Prasanna, we'll follow up with you later to show more details around international data transfer as well. All right, there was one more question. You can customize for specific jurisdictions. We have tags for that, rules for that. I showed you for GDPR and CPRA. You can add, I mean, we support more jurisdictions. So I think my health, my data, also we already have a support for that also. So yeah, that's possible as well. I see another question around how is this different from a data discovery? How about license and cost? Okay, yeah, I mean, licensing basically depends on the number of developers that are inside your org. That's how Privado prices. So if you need exact information, you can reach out and our sales team should be able to help you out. All right, and one last question. I think there was one around data discovery. How is Privado different from the current data discovery tools in the marketplace? So I would say two things. I think, again, taking an example of a privacy use case, privacy is not about just figuring out where your data lives at rest, right? It's not just, okay, data is in this database. You want to actually know a lot of privacy risks actually exist in the code because that's where the use of data happens, right? You can know we have a database where there is date of birth, but is that date of birth being used for authentication, or is that date of birth being sent to an advertiser for user profiling or targeting? That information never lies in the data. Data is only half of the picture. Half of the picture is in the code where use of data lies. And the corresponding way you do that is processing activity, right? So think of it, right? You have a data in a database, but you define a processing activity manually, saying, okay, tell us all your data processing activity. Code is the processing activity. Code is actually processing data on your behalf, and then collecting it, sharing and transforming it. It has a purpose attached to it as well. So I would say that's one big differentiator, is it actually builds the privacy picture for you. The second big differentiator is data discovery tools can only scan SaaS tools which allow them to scan. Privado, on the other hand, discovers and gives you the information of any third-party integration inside your code. So you get full visibility there as well. So I would say those are the difference. And I know we have 3 minutes left. There are no more questions. Thanks everyone for being on the webinar. If there are any more questions, you can send it us on our website, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. We are also going to be there at IIPP PSR. So if anyone is there, feel free to drop by our booth. We have a happy hour for privacy engineers and a dinner for privacy leaders. So feel free to join that as well. Look forward to meeting you soon. Bye, everyone.